And
Susan, 1 second. Amy, can you make me a co-host so I can share screen?
whoops.
Thanks. Okay, Monica, sorry.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And I'm excited. Oh, I'm Monica Moser from the Jackson Community Foundation, and I'm excited to introduce Paul Schmitz. See, I already did some process improvement from the last time. Paul comes to us from Milwaukee, and he is the CEO of Leading Inside Out and a senior advisor for the Collective Impact Forum, and also the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. And I have had the pleasure of getting to know Paul a little bit better over the last couple of years. And I am so thankful for you to give us a couple of hours of your time, and even more than that, because we did some planning sessions to get ready. So we just want to give you a warm Jackson welcome and get right to work. I know Amy has some instructions for us.
Yes, welcome. We're excited that you're joining us. Feel free to put any comments or questions that you have in the chat or raise your hand at any point. We will be breaking out, so there will be a chance to have some discussion afterwards. And then at the end, we'll have a survey link. And again, thanks for joining us.
All right, and I will warn you ahead of time, Paul talks fast and we have a lot of content in a very short period of time in order for us to have some time in smaller groups to talk about the things that he shares. So get ready. It's going to be a wild ride, part 2.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. Great to be back with some of you and new to some of you. So really the goal here is to share some content with you all, some of the lessons we've learned, and for you then to spend some time thinking about it in the context of your collaborative, and then have a little conversation together. But really, it's just a beginning. And the hope is that by having these 2 conversations, you all will be able to take this into other conversations. As we approached, it was 10 years ago that the first article that coined the term collective impact came out. And as we approached the 10th anniversary at the Collective Impact Forum, not of the work, because collective impact existed before it was called collective impact, but of the model of, that was built around this approach that people had organically found and discovered, that we started thinking about what are the biggest lessons we've learned. And in the previous session, which is recorded, I shared a piece that'll be coming out Monday in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called The 10 Dangers to Collective Impact, which shares 10 of the key dangers I found that groups face that kind of pull them away from success in collective impact, and lessons that support success, including having clear strategy to guide clear commitment, making sure the form of the collective follows a function in terms of the strategy, and that building a culture so that culture doesn't need strategy for breakfast. As we thought together at the forum about what's the biggest message we want to share for 10 years, it was really around centering equity and collective impact. That it's almost impossible to get to population level or systems change without focusing on equity as part of it. And so that's what we decided to share. And I'm just walk you through what we came up with. First, we just have to kind of define what equity means in this context. And we use a definition in our article that comes from the Urban Strategies Council, which is equity is fairness and justice achieved through systematically assessing disparities and opportunities, outcomes, and representation, and redressing those disparities through targeted actions. We've seen different attempts. The little photo on the left, there's like all blogs devoted to deconstructing it, and there should be no fence and everything else. I think the basic concept, and the right one came from Robert Wood Johnson, and people had other issues. I think the main point we're trying to get at is that typically in policy and social services and philanthropy, we've had a view over the last few decades that if we provided people access to the same services or interventions, that will enable everyone to achieve the outcomes we would like for our community. And what equity really recognizes is that people don't all start in the same place. And sometimes that's a result of a variety of characteristics. Often in our communities, race is one of them. But the notion is that if we're going to be equitable, we have to start with where people are and move everyone to that result. What we identified through the forum was 5 practices that we think are important for centering equity and collective impact work. And I'm going to walk through these one at a time. The first is grounding the work in data and context and targeting solutions. And here what we're talking about is targeted universalism, or what we often say is applying an equity lens to our strategies and impact. And that means we set a universal goal, say that we want to increase graduation rates in our community. And we want all children, we would like to, hit as many children as possible getting to that goal. But when we disaggregate data in our community, we find that certain populations are in different places relative to that goal. And that, again, often in our contexts, in communities across America, race is a factor that we see different. Sometimes it's geography or gender or other differences, but we have to understand, where are there disparities in the data? And where there are groups in different places relative to our goal, how do we identify the structures that support or impede those different groups? Are there other factors we need to be looking at that affect those groups' ability to achieve our goal? And then we have to target our strategies differentially to move everybody to that goal. And so really the distinction here is recognizing that our goal isn't to pull someone down to move someone up, it's that we want everyone to achieve that goal. If we know some are further behind than others and in different places, we have to think about how do we target our work differently to different groups to get everybody to that goal. So, and when we say grounding in data and context, data is information about people's lives. If we don't interpret it with expertise from the people whose lives it's about, if we don't interpret it in ways that bring in community context to that conversation, we often miss it and might not get it right. The second is to focus on systems change in addition to programs and services. And this one I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. And I know that in Jackson, you guys have used this, and I know Monica could teach this in her sleep, I think. But basically, there's an article called The Water of Systems Change that was also published by John Caney and others at FSG. And it looks at 6 types of systems changes. There's mental models and narratives. The mind frames are ways that people understand a problem. If someone believes that poverty is caused by laziness and choice, that's a mental model that they hold, right? I faced this in a community that was working on infant mortality, where people thought it was primarily a result of parents with alcohol or drugs and babies dying in bed, when that was less than 10% of the cause. And 60% of it was prematurity. We had to change the way the community viewed the problem in order to solve it. So one of the systems changes is changing the way people understand and think about the problem and what biases they hold about it. Relationships and connections in a system is another systems change, understanding how the systems work together or don't work together that interact on that issue. Power dynamics, and we'll talk more about that in a moment in terms of who has decision-making on this, who has influence on these issues. How do resources flow to the issue? What are the rules and practices that people doing this work are bound by? And what are the public policies that govern how we do this work? And so if systems change is changing the conditions that hold the problem in place, these are the 6 types of things that we see often hold the problem in place. And to address equity, we've got to be looking at how do these play out within equity, within the problem we're working on. And while we do programmatic interventions, we've got to always keep our eye on what are those system things that are holding the problem in place. The third is about shifting power within the collaborative. When we talk about power, it's the ability or authority to influence others, to decide who will have access to resources, and define reality or exercise control over oneself or others. It's really about having the ability to control decisions and resources. What we often look at is 2 kinds of power that come from formal and informal authority. Formal authority is that I'm in a role or position or control resources, and that's what gives me power in a community or a context. Informal authority is that authority that comes from relationships and credibility that people have. So in that case, I may be a grassroots leader, doesn't have a lot of control of resources, but I can turn 200 people out for a meeting. That's a lot of power. And so it's understanding that both in building power around a collective or any group, we have to think both in terms of formal and informal authority, in terms of building power within a collective. If we're trying to create change, we need both.
Hey,
And
Paul,
we've seen, yes.
this seems like a good place to ask this question. Bethany put in the chat, would you mind sharing if or how persons of color participated in developing these ideas you're sharing?
Yes, there are 6 of us who co-authored this, and half of those were people of color. And it was based on conversations and studies where we interviewed, I think, 12 collective impact efforts around the country, most of them people of color led, and used their examples throughout the article. And so it was something that was a collaborative approach, of which I'm one of 6 co-authors and people who worked on this. Thanks for the question. So the other way we can think about power is who's at the table, and the aligning of content and context expertise. That if we imagine our intended beneficiaries, the issues we work on, and the neighborhoods we serve at the center of our table, how many people at the table making decisions currently live there, or have lived there, or have family member there? How much does our table reflect the target population or represent other marginalized groups? How many of us have lived experience on the issue or family members with lived experience? How many of us directly work with the target population or manage people who work with the target population? And the understanding is, if we're all on the outside, do we have the best information about the people, the issues in the neighborhood to make decisions about the community? And if we're all on the inside, we often lack perspective. And so it's important to think about power, but also understand that in shifting power within a collaborative, we've got to be aware of who's at our tables and thinking about how do we make sure we're bringing both content expertise and context expertise, formal authority and informal authority to the tables where we're making decisions about communities and about these issues. The fourth is about listening to and acting with community. And here we often approach it from an asset-based perspective, which answers the age-old question, is the glass half empty or half full? And the correct answer is yes, it's both. And that glass, like every single one of us, like everyone we work with and everyone we serve, all of us have gifts and talents that make us great family members, friends, workers, leaders. We all have fullness, but every single one of us also has emptiness. One of the challenges we see is often community services, people who've been defined by their fullness, going into communities that have been defined by their emptiness to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness, with the notion our job is to fill them up with some of our fullness. And we think that at best is arrogant and at worst oppressive. We think great leaders are those who, even when staring into an individual or community's emptiness, they find and start with that fullness. If you think about those people closest to you, they know your emptiness more than anybody, but you'll be vulnerable with them. You'll share that. You'll seek help from them because you know no matter what you share with them, they'll always see you from the place of your fullness. And that's why you feel open. And it's the same thing in communities. And so in reality, we could look at many communities in this country that have this set of challenges, and they're real, those exist. They happen. But our argument would be in every single community where every single one of these things exists, every single one of these things exists. And the question is, where are you starting? What are you seeing? What's your perspective? What's the story you're telling about the community? What's the way you're representing the community in your literature and your work? And what's the story what does that story tell people about what you believe about them, what you believe about the community, what you believe about the people you're partnering with in community? The other way to think about this, which relates also to power shifting, is to think about what's the level at which you're going to engage community in your work. Is it to orient them to what's happening and the changes coming, in which you're informing them of what decisions you make? Is it consulting before you make a decision, where you get community input before you make a final decision and then let them know? Is it involved where at every step of your process, you're making sure that community voice and perspective and partnership is there? Is it collaborate where you co-create and co-produce solutions with community members, or empower where community makes decisions and you support and follow what they decide? And the reality is that there's realities around why groups might be in different places, but too often people use language on the right side and deliver engagement on the left side. And what we would argue is to be authentic in terms of what you promise and fulfill that promise, and always push yourself to how can we shift more power and shift more engagement, because often the solution to so many challenges is about, and building them equitably is about not just building solutions or programs, but building community. That stronger communities and thriving communities are where things work better. Finally, it's building equity, leadership, and accountability. And because the question was asked earlier, with my partner Dominique Samari from P3 Development Group, which is a African-American woman-owned racial equity and inclusion consulting firm, we built this list of 8 practices that we believe that leaders can take that help them be more accountable in leadership. The first is to seek out relationships and to seek out authentic relationships, share, learn, and really being self-aware and being willing to share oneself. That coming into relationships with people and building authentic relationships is key to beginning any journey. The second is visible commitments that articulate measurable goals and expectations, and in which people invite folks to hold them accountable for their commitments to equity. The third is looking at the policies and practices of an organization or institution and looking where bias might be hiding, where it might be sitting, and figuring out how to create measurable goals with clear accountability. The fourth is acknowledging and redressing harms that past policies and practices have created. The fifth is requiring diversity at every table and not making decisions without diverse participation and perspectives. That we get to a point where we realize, like, hey, I don't think we have the right people here to make these choices today. We need to bring more perspective before we do something. The sixth is about building and sharing power. And what we often talk about is there's always conversations about equity, about power and privilege. And the idea here is that if one has power and privilege, it's not a problem. The question is, how are you using that? Are you hoarding it? Are you transmitting and sharing it mainly with people like you? Or are you using it to create pathways for others and building and sharing your power and using that privilege in ways that support others to gain that as well? The seventh is showing up for leaders of color and people of color-led organizations and public issues impacting communities of color, and not just on behalf of your organization's interests. Sometimes we see leaders show up when it matters to them, but not show up on other issues of importance to communities. And it makes it look more their commitment look more transactional than not. And finally, it's visibly taking stands and willing to risk or sacrifice resources and relationships in standing up for racial equity and justice. And so when we think about what does it mean for a leader to be on a journey of accountability around equity, these are the practices that we tend to think of move one in that direction. And again, the article itself is there's a PDF of it in the chat, and we'll share these slides as well as the ones from last session afterward. But those are the practices that, again, we think are important to center equity, grounding the work in the data and context, using that target universalism, focusing on systems change as well as programs and services, shifting power in terms of who's at tables and making decisions, listening and acting with community, and building leadership and accountability that actually practices these things. And so, as with the last session, what we're going to invite you all to do is we've created another Jam board, and we're going to break people into groups. And again, you'll have about 20 minutes, and there's 5 practices. And what we're going to invite you to do is to go to the Jam board and again, look at the list of those 5 and think about what lessons could we be learning or things could we be improving here in our collaborative. And you can leave those Post-it notes again where you think that might be helpful. And then we'll come back and have time for a Q&A and any report backs. If groups could pick one person for their group just to share for a minute or so about what they talked about in the room, that would be great. And so remember to call on someone from your group, volunteer someone or whatever to do that. That would be great. So we'll see you in about 20 minutes. And thank you so much. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you. And again, I'd love to ask if each room, if somebody would be willing to share a few highlights from your conversation, that'd be great. And we'll start with room 1 with Alexa, Brian, Chris, Marcus, and Monica.
Hello, I'm Brian. I was selected to report out.
Great.
We talked about many things, and I made myself a haphazard little note here. Many of the things that we talked about revolved around communication. And so as a grand heading, I would say how we communicate, how we listen to the community, and having the right versus wrong people at the table, and needing always to make sure that what we are listening to is what the community is telling us, making sure that communication is solid, that leadership needs to reflect the voice of the community. That comes, a lot of what we hear from the community comes from collecting data. We also talked about the importance of qualitative data, matching and reflecting what the community is telling us in terms of their personal data, which is hard to qualify at times. We talked a bit about the need for more mental health services, and how the pandemic has definitely helped to shine a light on the importance of mental health and working with students. I definitely see that on a day-to-day basis. Having an 18-year-old daughter, I definitely see that on a day-to-day basis. We also talked about human-centered design, and the community knowing what it needs, and having the need to just listen and sit back and ask them in a way that shows that we are listening, and we are communicating back to them the needs that they're telling us, that we're in sync with the needs, not just assuming that from our position we know what those needs are. And one of the things that impacted me was the conversation around the population that we are seeing the cup half full, going into communities and populations with the cup half empty, and attempting to meet their needs, and assuming that we know what they're talking about, just having alignment between where we are and our well-intended efforts meeting what the community is actually telling us.
Great, thank you so much. Let's go to room 2, where we had Ashley, Jeremy, Michelle, Rebecca, and Terry.
Yeah, we did a lot of great talking, so there's no way I'm going to capture it all. So I want to apologize for that out of the gun. One of the things that we talked about, the data, and this happened to us in real time. And so I was sharing with Michelle and Ashley, we were talking that this is happening out to college. We're Achieving the Dream School. So we've been desegregating data for about 10 years, and we have efforts, and we were moving the dial, nowhere we wanted, nowhere near where we needed to be. So I want to be clear, but we were moving the dial on very targeted populations. But what we learned when COVID came is we needed to reevaluate immediately, because in reality, what the students brought to the table changed that the minute COVID happened. Just, we thought we were finding all of those things that was causing students issues before, but when COVID came, we didn't stop and completely reevaluate everything and change our services. So the progress we were making, we had the data, we were looking at it, it was going up and up, and it literally fell off a cliff in those populations. I mean, we have to report it for our Achieving the Dream, and so we were looking at it in real time, and we've been having conversations the last month of what to do, and we did change our services, but not enough to address those populations. So what we realize is the data has to be constantly reevaluated. Our services have to be constantly reevaluated. This never ends, and it has to be just perpetual over and over again. And like I said, we're dealing with that right now in real time, and these conversations are happening as we're sitting here.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Let's go to room 3. And we've got Sheila, Nancy, Janine, Janelle, and our colleague from the Heritage Foundation.
Okay, I'm the note taker, so I'm
great.
I got voluntold, but if anybody wants to hop in while I'm on this, please do so. So we started with targeted universalism, and everybody is at different points in collecting data. We had some mature people who had been segregating data for like 10 years, and then myself, who we just started disaggregating data recently in our organization. But the big thing was COVID shining a brighter light, piggybacking on what Jeremy said, and taking a deep dip and dive and saying, oh God, we don't even know what we're doing based on what COVID exposed. And then the other thing that was brought up is that we can collect all this disaggregated data, but if we're not doing anything about it, what are we doing about it? And then the focus on systems change, just saying that we tend to focus on programs and services, like schools and districts, they're really focused on what's the next initiative that we can do. But the big thing that was talked about here is that decision makers, we're the decision makers aren't really changing the way that they're doing things in terms of the systems. And if the decision makers aren't changing things, the systems won't change because policies won't get changed. And we actually had some good ideas. Well, there was an example, I won't go into this, but one of the persons on our team talked about the Jackson and the homeless population and the jails and the hospitals. When people go into the hospitals, they're sick, they get discharged, they have no place to go. And she talked about that Jackson is trying to have an aligned effort on what to do with the folks that are homeless and where will they go when they get discharged, and about all the systems being aligned and doing the same thing with this population so they have a place to go. So I thought that was a really great example of that. And then we talked about too, for shifting power within the collaborative, us coming up with a power policy goal. So every org or business just say, okay, we're going to take one policy this year and we're going to dig into it and see if we can change it. And here's a best practice policy, like for job postings. This is what it should look like in our best world of equity. And then everyone else try to pick apart what they're doing in that area. So that was a cool idea, I thought.
Thank you, Nancy. Let's go to the next room. We have Kathy, Dana, Michelle, and Molly.
Well, I took the notes, but I'm not sure I can explain all the notes. So we talked about data, and is the data that we're using really data that was gathered for a consistent purpose for what we're trying to use it for now? You know, so have we really gone back in and see how those questions were asked and of whom they were asked, and is that group relevant, and is that purpose relevant to what we're trying to learn now, or are we just using some old data? We talked about that great chart that had the circle in the middle with the people with the lived experience versus the circle on the outside where people are trying to develop all those programs. And we acknowledge that, you know, we are all trying to get input from the middle, but we're not necessarily all trying to share our power with people in the middle. And so how are we going to figure out how to do that, right? And to purposefully figure that piece out. And then another comment that I took notes on were, you know, are we sure we know whose voices are missing? Do we know our community well enough to know who we should be talking about? I liked the idea that you talked about go to meetings and things that aren't related to what you're doing, right? Be out in the community listening in other environments and in other situations. And that takes a real, you know, team focus. And the other piece of that is I have several friends who are always invited to be the voice at the table, no matter, seems like, whatever the issue is. And once I was told, quit inviting me. I can't represent everybody on everything. You need to find some more volunteers, right? So are we always going to the same core group, or are we actually expanding our network of people who have lived experience in a particular area and including those people at the table?
Great. Thank you, Kathy. Let's go to Lori, Mary, Stephanie, and Tracy.
Sure. So we spent a lot of time initially talking about the data and context and targeted solutions. And what we really came up with is, in the data arena, we have quantitative data coming out of every orifice, right? What we lack is voice and story, right? And that's how you change mindsets. Not everybody digs data, right? Sorry, Megan, not everybody digs data. But at any rate, when you have voice and story, that can bring context, and that helps to bring people along with that. And so we spent a lot of time with that. The other thing that we spent a significant amount of time on was listening and acting with the community. And really that came back to authentic engagement, right? If you're not authentically engaging with the people with the problem who also have the solution, and you're not working together, offering up your power and your resources to them, then you've done them a disservice. So that conversation really, really revolved around authentically engaging folks.
Wow. Great, thank you. Let's go to the last room, which is Jamie, Megan, Sarah, and Todd.
I think that we were so busy talking that we didn't choose a person to report out, but I'll do that. We focused on two pieces, the number one and number two. And the first one, we were talking about the importance of what one of the members called a sentinel event. How do you look at a piece of data that is so mind-blowing and wrong that it motivates the community to change? I mean, when we look at George Floyd, right, it motivated us all across the country to take this thing that had hardly just started in May of 2020, take it more seriously and demand change. How do you do that with data without wrapping the community in a shroud of deficit? How do you keep yourself looking at the glass half full and the glass half empty simultaneously, and understanding that? That was one thing we talked about. The other piece was that when we come together, number two was the idea of changing systems and meeting immediate responsibilities and needs. And the discussion of the sock drive that happens every winter in Jackson. It's a needed piece. It's incredibly important. Kids can't wait to have warm feet until we get our acts together to fix systems. We have to do something today. They're getting sick. A second thing, why is that enough? And why is it enough that we do it every winter? And why is it enough that we'll expect to do it next winter? Because it's not a lack of money. It's not a lack of socks, right? It's a system problem. It's a social justice system problem. And how do we keep two arms moving at the same time? One that is meeting immediate needs, and one that refuses to be okay with just meeting immediate needs and asking about what systems need to be repaired. And that's what we spoke of mostly.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. I've dropped the slides, a PDF of the slides in, as well as just repost in case anyone joined late, a PDF of the article from the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Both are there for you to download and use, share. Hopefully the slides, which you all now have access to, and the notes people took will be food for some conversations and work within the collaborative. And really, again, today the goal was to really just start a conversation, give you some content to play with and think about, and hopefully the conversations continue. And this work of both strengthening the collective and also ensuring greater equity in the collective will be things that you'll continue to pursue. So thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me. And I'll hand it back to Monica to kind of start to close us out.
All right, thank you so much, Paul. Sarah has put a SurveyMonkey link in the chat box. I'm sure she's also going to email it out after we're done. If you can give us feedback, that's great. If you like stuff like this, was this valuable? How could we improve what we're doing? What other kinds of information might you like to hear? And then what should we do after this? We talked about having some debrief sessions where we can get together and maybe have access to the notes and think more about how this might influence our work as we move forward. So Nancy says, bring it back once a month. Probably not realistic, but we love you, Paul. So we're really thankful. Thank you, Irene, for, it was wonderful having outsiders, and I think just getting kind of a feel for the work that we're doing in Jackson. And we know it's not perfect, but we are doing work together, and it's not, I think sometimes we always give ourselves a bad rap, but I think we're doing good things. We're always improving. And this was another effort for us to maybe do a reset as we get back to whatever this new normal is. So please give us feedback in that SurveyMonkey, and I will see you somewhere in Jackson soon. Thank you all for coming, and keep showing up every day. I appreciate you. Bye, Paul.
Thanks, everyone. Good to meet
Thank
all
you.
of you. Bye-bye.